To shoot cinematic video, you don't really need big cameras and expensive lenses. Often people think you really need a big setup, a big crew, and plenty of money to throw in to create cinematic footage. The truth is, you can get pretty amazing results with the phone that you carry in your pocket. The sequence you just saw was shot in around 20 minutes with an iPhone 12 Pro Max, a gimbal, and a monopod. That's all there was to it, with no previous prep, simply by knowing what to do and how to do it. In this video, I'm going to break down everything you need to create cinematic videos. There is a fair bit to cover, so I'm breaking this up in 2 separate videos, which is going to help make things easier to digest. Just a quick insert to say that I'll be giving away a Zion Smooth 4 gimbal in this video. To win it, all you need to do is get right how many times I say the word cinematic throughout this video, including this one that I just said. So leave your numbers in the comments below, and if I'm able to verify you as a subscriber, I'll be sending you this completely free of charge, and I'll even pay for the shipping anywhere in the world. Just make sure that I can contact you, because in the last giveaway that I gave, 3 people got it right, but I was only able to get through to 1 person, and that's the one that won it. So you have 2 weeks to get this right, and I'll be announcing the winner on the video that I release on August 27th. If more than 1 person gets it right, I'll be doing a raffle on that same video, and this is why it's so important that I'm able to contact you. But if 3 or 4 people get it right, you stand a better chance to win out of 4 or 5 people than if I just pick 1 person randomly out of 1,000 or 2,000. In terms of the video itself, any of these tips that I give you on their own, it won't make that much of a difference. It's just as good as running the camera on auto. But if you apply them all, trust me on this, your videos will start to look amazing. It goes without saying that I could have always done the opening sequence better. There is always room for improvement in everything you do in life. But I just wanted to illustrate how relatively easy it is to shoot something that looks a bit better than the average video, just by adding a little bit of imagination. We just turned up, shot it, and left. No need for filming permits, no need to warn the police, book the venue, a location agency, nothing. You can get away with so much by just using a phone and a little creativity. And yes, I could have spent the day planning everything, thinking of every shot, storyboarding the whole thing, creating a shot list. I could have even gone all out and booked a big Ariel XA camera with a big film crew, and yes, things would have looked better. But do you really need all of that to create cinematic videos that are likely to live in YouTube? Of course not. You probably carry right this moment a 4K 10-bit camera in your pocket, and you might not even know it. Now let me be clear. If you need a DSLR look, or things to look like they were shot on a mirrorless camera, well, you need to use one of those cameras. I'm not saying here that your smartphone will look better than, let's say, a Sony a7S III. There is a time and a place for each and every camera. But let me tell you, if you get things right, the footage out of any smartphone these days will look amazing and can go head to head against anything out there. And I mean that. I'm gonna give you or show you 20 tips to shoot cinematic video that will turn your smartphone into a professional camera. I kid you not. And the first tip above anything else that I can give you is to use a third-party app and not use the default camera app that comes with your phone. The default camera apps, honestly, are rubbish, and they don't give you much control over your image. I use Filmic Pro, and I'm basing this video around it, but the concepts and principles are the same, whatever other app you use, whether it's ProTake, Mavis Pro, Movie Pro, Open Camera, or whatever other app, as well as any DSLR or film camera. This is like riding a bike. If you learn to balance yourself on 2 wheels, you can go from one type of bike to another. The fundamentals are all the same. Okay, first golden rule. Make sure that you shoot at the highest possible resolution that your phone allows. And these days, that is 4K. Having that additional resolution will give you a lot of flexibility in post. You can, for instance, turn a boring static shot into an interesting track in or track out by simply zooming in or zooming out slightly in post. Honestly, the best thing you can do is start with the cleanest and best looking image that you can get. In terms of frame rate, make sure that you set up your phone at 24 frames per second. This is the default and standard frame rate for things to look less video or TV and more cinematic. Now you need to bear in mind the rolling shutter effect that all smartphones and mid to low-end cameras suffer. You don't have this issue with the high-end digital film cameras because they use global shutter. But this is something to bear in mind. Personally, I like to set the cameras at 25 frames per second because having that extra frame per second somehow makes the video out of smartphones look a bit less jerky and a bit more pleasant to the eye. But this is entirely up to you. You need to experiment and find out which one works better for you, whether it's 24 or 25. Try and shoot at the higher frame rate if you can. 4K 60 frames per second would be ideal, but your smartphone will most likely only allow you to do 4K at 30 frames per second. But having a slow-mo footage means that you can get rid of any wobble or jerky moves that you might have if you do any handheld or gimbal moves. You just need to make sure that if you have people in the frame, that it's okay for them to play back at slow-mo and you don't need them to play back at normal speed. But having a slow-mo footage immediately makes things look really nice and definitely much more cinematic than normal speed. Use a third-party app, please. I use an iPhone 12 Pro Max and the default app is diabolical. It's an absolute piece of garbage. The least you can do is invest $13, $14, $15 in a camera app that will transform your smartphone into a semi-professional camera. I use Filmic Pro for the simple fact that I get the Filmic remote, which is an additional app that I find very helpful, especially if you do any Jeep type of shots or any remote work. You can control the phone remotely. You can do pretty much everything at a distance without the need of touching the smartphone. And this is great if you want to do all sorts of creative shots where distance is a bit of an issue. And I have a video that I recently made about creative shots using this type of setup, which I put a link just above now. But please do not use the default app. Having a third-party app means that you can control all aspects of the smartphone, almost like a professional camera. So you control the ISO, the color space, the resolution, the frame rate, the white balance, anything and everything that you can think of, you can control it, which is something that you cannot do with the default app. Honestly, you need this. Otherwise, you are limiting so much what you can do with your phone. Choose the highest possible bitrate that your phone allows. In my case, I use the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I get the choice between 8-bit and 10-bit, and I usually stick to 10-bit, simply because the difference between 8 and 10-bit is massive, to the tune of nearly 1 billion colors, which makes a massive difference in post-production, and especially when it comes to grade and how much you can tweak and stretch the image. Honestly, you get a much clearer and nicer images shooting at 10-bit than 8-bit by a long mile. Look, the higher the bitrate, the nicer the image and the richer the colors are. So trust me, stick to 10-bit if you can afford it. You'll thank me for this because the difference in image quality is phenomenal. Never shoot on auto exposure. It's the quickest way to spot amateur video. You need ND filters to expose an image correctly. Now, if you let your smartphone on auto, it will automatically adjust to the brightness level in the surroundings, and it will give you some really sharp and choppy footage because it needs to bring up the shutter speed so high that it will look anything but cinematic. You want to stick to the 180-degree rule, which means that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So if you are on 25 frames per second, your shutter speed is 50. If you are on 24, it needs to be 48. Although most smartphones won't give you 48, will probably stick to 50. But NDs are an essential, if not the most essential accessory that will help your footage look cinematic. When trying to expose correctly on a smartphone, obviously you cannot adjust the aperture on the lens. Those are locked and there is nothing you can do. You can only adjust the ISO and the shutter. You want to keep your shutter at 50, so the only thing you can adjust is the ISO. And this is why NDs are so important, because it's the only way to compensate for that additional brightness levels. What you need to make sure is that you don't either underexpose or overexpose. And this is where tools like the Histogram or false color come into play. These are tools that you need to learn because they give you visual cues right then on the screen, and it will be the difference between getting images correctly exposed or in a complete mess. One thing that is really important is to make sure that you lock both exposure and white balance, because you don't want them to be changing halfway through your shot. And in terms of exposure, these smartphones don't have a huge dynamic range. It's all about computational photography. So my advice is that you try to expose to the highlights, but all in all, it's a bit of a compromise. You need to find a middle ground where your highlights are not too hot and your shadows are not too dark. So when you bring your footage into the grade, you have all the information there. And this is why histograms and false color are so important, because they'll give you visual cues as to what is overexposed and underexposed in your image. Getting the exposure right in your shot is really important. And the one thing that you don't want it to happen is to change halfway through your shot. What I'm about to illustrate now is something really important, and it's the transition from a bright space into a dark space. So for instance, now I have exposure locked to a very bright environment, and see what happens when I go into a darker area of this park where I am. And this happens whether you are on a smartphone or a high-end camera, okay? Cameras behave exactly the same way. And as you can clearly see, as I'm entering a darker part of the park, everything goes much darker because I am exposed to the brights outside, okay? There is nothing you can do. This will happen with whatever camera you use. I have now exposed to the shadows, and as you can clearly see, everything looks fine and the way it's supposed to be. But if I just simply walk back to the brighter part of the park, see what happens to the shot. Everything becomes overexposed and way too bright, because I have locked my exposure to a darker level of brightness, and everything is blown out. I have now exposed correctly to the brightness levels, so now I'm looking fine, but as you can clearly see, the background looks very, very dark. So this is something you need to be very mindful, so when you plan your shots, so you don't find yourself in this situation where you transition from a bright space to a dark space, and then your exposure goes all over the place. And in terms of the white balance, you want to make sure that in every single location that you're in, you set your white balance correctly, or if you change location or even time of day, you need to keep on adjusting or changing the white balance. Now you can leave it on auto and the phone will adjust it automatically, but again, you don't want to do this because halfway through the shot, you might move from a very well lit area to a slightly darker area and the color temperature changes, and you don't want those shifts to happen in your frame. You want to lock it and that's it. It doesn't move. It's all about the grade, and if you need to fix something, you can do it in the grade. But trust me, you don't want to have those swings halfway through your shot because it will literally ruin it. Most camera apps will give you the option to set it on auto and then lock that white balance. And this is what I advise that you do, because it means that in every location, you'll get the correct white balance. There is nothing worse than going to your edit and find out that all your footage is at the wrong color temperature. And there is a limit of how much you can fix in post, because these cameras are not the greatest and the best. So you want to make sure that you start with everything correctly exposed and with the correct color temperature. Learn to use the histogram and false color. Honestly, these are essential tools that will help you make sure that your footage is correctly exposed, whatever the environment. Histogram will tell you whether your image is overexposed or underexposed, and false color will show you exactly where in your image are your overexposed and underexposed areas and what in your footage is correctly exposed. Using a histogram, for instance, the far right are the highlights and the far left is the shadows. And you don't want either one of those peaking. You want to have a sort of a triangle. And you will never be able to get that because every image, every environment is different. But what you want to make sure to avoid is that either one of those ends are peaking, because once they do that, you can't recover that information. It will be either pure black or pure white. And the perfect example is when you have clouds in the sky, and whether it's a sunny day or a completely cloudy day, you'll notice in your histogram that that far right section or area is peaking. And what you need to do is reduce the ISO or increase the neutral density filter to compensate for that brightness level, because you don't want those clouds to be overblown and being completely white, because that means that you can't recover any information in post and it will just look like pure white. These phones don't have big latitudes, so essentially you have to find middle ground between the highlights and the shadows and get the image correctly exposed. Use a gimbal if possible to stabilize your footage. If you want to get consistent smooth shots time and time again, you're going to need a gimbal. Phones have come a long way in recent times in terms of lens stabilization, but the flexibility and range of moves that you get from a gimbal, you will never be able to match it by holding the phone handheld. Yes, you can do crazy shots with your hands, but the range of shots that you can do with a gimbal is way, way more. If you can afford a gimbal, at least get yourself a camera cage. It will go a long way in helping you stabilize the footage. And we'll come to that in a minute. One of the best things that you can do is to add movement to your shots. Don't just stay static in the same spot, panning right and left or up and down like most people do. Look for things in your surroundings, street furniture, plants, anything that can help you initiate or instigate movement. A review shot, for instance, Adding foreground elements to your image will add depth to your footage and it will immediately make your videos look better. But when you move, don't do it fast. Do it slowly. Allow the camera to breathe. Camera movement is not about fast panning. That's for a sports video. If you want cinematic footage, movements need to be slow and precise. Like I said earlier in the video, I split this video in two because otherwise it would be far too long and it would be really difficult to digest. If you're interested in the following 10 tips, there is a video appearing just about here. Click on it and it will take you directly there. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to the channel if you're new to it and you haven't done so already. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.